The spring Owen Carter turned 13, he began digging into the driest part of his family's ranch. The slope above the lower pasture had not produced useful grass in years. From a distance, it looked like a broad brown back rising toward the mesa, broken by stones, thorny weeds, and a few stubborn clumps of bunchgrass. Cattle rarely climbed there anymore. There was too little to eat, and the exposed ground became dangerously slick whenever rain finally came. Owen carried a pickaxe, a shovel, and a coil of old rope up the hill before sunrise. He tied one end of the rope to a wooden stake and used it to scratch curved lines into the soil. Each curve opened toward the higher ground. Then he followed the marks with his pickaxe, cutting shallow trenches shaped like half-moons. The soil he removed was not thrown aside. Owen packed it along the lower edge of each curve, forming a low rounded ridge. He stamped the loose earth with his boots, added small stones, and moved several feet sideways before beginning the next one. By noon, the slope was covered with strange arcs. His older sister, Emily, stopped beside the fence and studied them. "It looks like the hill is smiling," she said. Their father, Henry Carter, was less entertained. He climbed halfway up the slope and pushed one boot against a newly built ridge. Loose soil crumbled down the hill. "You know one hard rain could break this," he said. "That is why I am testing them here. This whole hill is the place where water goes when it wants to leave." Owen looked toward the dry gullies below. That is the problem. If you enjoy quiet stories about farming, patience, and people who notice what others overlook, subscribe and join us. Sometimes the smallest change begins where everyone else has already stopped looking. The neighbors soon noticed the work. One said Owen was digging giant horseshoe prints. Another asked whether he planned to plant watermelons inside the curves. A rancher named Calvin Brooks called them moon craters and predicted that the first storm would erase every one of them. Owen did not argue. He kept working during the cool morning hours. He made the curves wider than the first ones and placed them in a staggered pattern so no two openings stood directly above each other. Inside some, he arranged dry branches and fist-sized rocks. They were not meant to block water completely. They were meant to interrupt its speed. The hill did not suffer only because rain was rare. It suffered because when rain came, the water stayed for almost no time at all. Owen was not trying to build a reservoir. He wanted to borrow the storm for a few extra minutes. On dry land, a few minutes could decide whether water entered the soil or carried the soil away. The Carter Ranch covered several hundred acres in Mesa County, Colorado, but much of that land could not support cattle throughout the year. The lower pasture grew enough grass during good seasons. The higher flats held scattered shrubs and tough native plants. The dry slope between them had become the weakest part of the property. Grandfather Walter remembered when it looked different. He kept an old photograph in a wooden box beside his desk. In the picture, cattle stood near the same hillside, but the ground behind them carried wider patches of grass. The gullies were smaller. Bare soil existed, but it did not dominate the slope. Owen placed the photograph beside a newer one. The difference was difficult to ignore. "What happened?" he asked. Walter did not blame one storm or one dry year. He explained that the land had changed gradually. Cattle had grazed the easiest plants. Dry seasons weakened the roots. Wind removed fine dust. Then sudden summer rain struck the exposed surface and began carrying the richest soil downhill. One storm removed a thin layer. The next storm followed the small channels left behind. Those channels deepened, water moved faster, and fewer seeds remained long enough to grow. The land was not destroyed all at once. It was losing pieces of itself. Owen had seen the process after a thunderstorm the previous summer. Rain had fallen for less than an hour, but brown water poured from the slope in narrow streams. At the lower fence, the runoff left mud, grass stems, seeds, and stones piled against the wire. The hillside had received water. Yet the following morning, most of it was dry again. Walter found an old soil conservation booklet that described small earthworks used in dry regions. Some were contour trenches. Others were shallow basins or crescent-shaped catchments built to slow runoff and collect sediment. The drawings were simple. Water moving downhill entered the open side of a curve. The lower ridge reduced its speed. As the water slowed, soil and organic material settled. The trapped moisture then had more time to soak into the ground. Owen decided to test the idea before expanding it. Near the house, he filled 2 long wooden trays with dry ranch soil and raised one end of each tray on bricks. He left the first surface smooth. In the second, he shaped several small half-moons. Using 2 identical buckets, he poured water over the upper ends. The smooth tray released a muddy stream almost immediately. Fine soil collected in the pan below. In the second tray, water entered the small curves and paused. Some overflowed, but the stream leaving the tray was slower and carried less dirt. Henry watched the experiment from the workshop doorway. "A tray is not a hillside," he said.
"No," Owen answered.
"But the water still follows the same direction." Henry nodded once. "Then make sure you understand where it goes when your curves fill." That warning stayed with Owen. Holding water was only half the work. The system also needed a safe way to release what it could not hold. A poorly placed trench could concentrate runoff and make erosion worse. Owen marked a control section where he would dig nothing. He also began watching the natural paths water had already carved into the hill. He was no longer drawing random smiles in the dirt. He was learning the language the rain had written there. The first rain was not large enough to be called a storm. Dark clouds crossed the mesa one afternoon, dropped a brief shower, and moved east before sunset. Owen climbed the slope the following morning expecting to find water standing inside his half-moons. Instead, he found damage. Several ridges had collapsed. He had dug the early curves too deeply and built their lower walls from loose soil. When the basins filled, water pushed through the weakest points. One broken ridge directed its overflow into the curve below it. That second curve failed too. A short chain of erosion ran down the slope, cutting a fresh groove through the middle of Owen's work. Henry stood beside him in silence. Owen stared at the broken earth. "I made it worse." In that line, yes. His father did not soften the answer. A farm experiment did not become useful merely because the person doing it had good intentions. Owen spent the morning studying every failure. The curves placed directly beneath one another had collected too much water in the same path. The steep-sided basins filled quickly. Their narrow ridges became small dams, and small dams failed violently when they had no controlled overflow. Owen returned to Walter's booklet and read the sections he had skimmed before. Then he rebuilt. The new half-moons were broader and shallower. Owen packed the lower ridges in thin layers instead of piling loose earth all at once. He extended the ends gently along the contour rather than stopping them with abrupt corners. Most importantly, he added spillways. At one side of each curve, he left a slightly lower section reinforced with flat stones. When the basin filled, excess water could escape there and spread across the slope instead of cutting through the middle of the ridge. He also changed the layout. The half-moons were staggered like bricks in a wall. Water passing between 2 curves in the upper line would meet a curve lower down, but not directly beneath the same overflow. The work became slower. Owen checked the slope with a simple water level made from clear tubing. He followed the natural contour instead of trusting what looked level to his eyes. Hard ground forced him to swing the pickaxe repeatedly. Stones hidden below the surface bruised his hands through the handle. Several curves had to be moved after he discovered they crossed active drainage channels. Calvin Brooks drove past one evening and saw Owen repairing the damaged section. "Storm already win," he called. "The first round," Owen answered. Calvin laughed and continued down the road. After the next light rain, Owen returned to the hill. 2 ridges had minor cracks, but most remained intact. Thin layers of dark mud had settled behind the lower edges. Twigs, dry leaves, and grass seeds rested against the stones. On the untreated control slope, fresh lines ran through the bare soil. Inside Owen's curves, the rain had left behind what it usually carried away: sediment. The difference was still small enough to fit in his palm. But soil had begun collecting where soil had once disappeared. The early summer passed without a meaningful rain. By the end of June, the slope hardened under the sun. Dust gathered inside the half-moons. The small branches Owen had placed there turned grey and brittle. Even Henry began wondering whether the system would receive a proper test before autumn. Then, during the final week of July, the weather changed. Clouds rose above the western mesa in the afternoon, tall and dark, their lower edges dragging curtains of rain across the distant land. The air cooled. Wind pressed the pasture grass flat and carried the smell of wet stone ahead of the storm. A weather warning came over the radio. Heavy rainfall was expected in a short period. Henry moved equipment into the shed and checked the lower drainage crossing. Owen climbed partway up the hill to inspect the spillways one final time, but thunder forced him back. The rain arrived with startling force. Large drops struck the hard ground and burst into dust before the surface darkened. Within minutes, water began moving between the stones. Small streams joined larger ones, and the old gullies filled with brown runoff. Owen and Henry watched from beneath the equipment shed roof. On the control section, water accelerated down the exposed slope. It followed old channels, widened their edges, and carried muddy foam toward the lower fence. On the treated section, the first half-moons filled quickly. Water entered the open curves, struck the branches and stones, and lost some of its speed. The basins turned brown as suspended soil settled. When they reached capacity, the reinforced spillways released thin sheets of overflow toward the staggered curves below. The system did not remain perfect. One ridge near the steepest gully broke through. Another overflowed at the wrong end and carved a short channel before reaching the next basin. A third filled with more debris than water. But most of the half-moons held. The storm continued into the evening. There was no magical barrier across the hill. Water still reached the pasture. Mud still gathered at the fence. Yet the runoff from Owen's section arrived more slowly and looked less violent than the stream from the untreated ground. By dawn, the clouds had moved east. Owen climbed the slope with Henry and Walter. The control area showed fresh erosion. Several narrow grooves had deepened, and new fans of sediment lay below them. The treated section looked untidy but different. Dozens of half-moons still contained shallow pools. Dark sediment covered their floors. Seeds, leaves, manure fragments, and bits of dry grass had collected behind the ridges. Walter pushed a walking stick into the mud. Hours after the rain ended, water was still soaking into the hill. Henry examined the failed ridge first. "We rebuild this one wider," he said. It was the first time he had spoken of the system as shared work. Owen had not stopped the storm. He had changed what part of the storm did after it arrived. Instead of rushing away immediately, some of the water had remained long enough to enter the ground. 3 days after the storm, the standing water disappeared. The hill returned to brown beneath the summer sun. From the ranch road, the half-moons again looked like empty scratches across dry ground. A visitor might have assumed that nothing had changed. Owen knew to wait. 2 weeks later, he found the first green shoots. They emerged inside one of the lower curves where the storm had deposited the deepest layer of sediment. The plants were small, no taller than his finger, but they followed the shape of the basin. More appeared after that. Native grass seeds carried by wind and water germinated in the moist soil behind the ridges. A few annual weeds appeared too. In some basins, nothing grew at all. But across the treated slope, faint green arcs began interrupting the brown ground. The control section remained mostly bare. By autumn, the difference could be felt as well as seen. Owen pushed his shovel into the center of a half-moon. The soil was deeper and softer than the surrounding surface. Fine roots held the collected sediment together. Beneath several branches, insects had begun breaking down trap plant material. The system had not restored the hillside in one season. Some curves filled with weeds. Several ridges cracked during dry weather. The failed section near the steep gully required careful redesign. On the sharpest slopes, Henry decided that digging more basins would be too risky without professional guidance. The work also required maintenance. After each heavy rain, Owen checked the spillways and removed debris that could redirect overflow. A neglected half-moon could become a new erosion channel. A useful structure depended on careful placement and regular repair. Calvin Brooks visited after an autumn shower. He walked up the treated section and stopped beside a curve lined with young grass. "That came in by itself?" he asked. "Water carried some seed. Wind carried some." Calvin pressed his boot into the collected soil. "My south pasture has a slope like this." Owen showed him the broken ridge first. He explained that the method was not simply a matter of digging holes. The curves had to follow the contour. They needed broad spillways, stable ridges, and enough spacing to prevent overflow from concentrating. He also explained that a hillside with severe erosion might require an experienced land specialist. Small earthworks could help, but careless digging could cause damage. Calvin listened without joking. The following spring, Henry helped Owen expand the project to a second section. They used a level, marked natural drainage paths, and left the steepest ground untouched. Walter scattered a small amount of locally appropriate grass seed inside several finished basins. Over the next seasons, the half-moons became harder to see, not because they disappeared, but because vegetation began growing around them. The green arcs widened. Roots stabilized the sediment. Each storm still took something from the ranch, but the treated slope lost less than it had before. Owen did not make the rain fall more often. He did not rebuild decades of lost soil in a single summer. He simply taught the next storm to slow down. On dry land, saving water does not always mean placing it inside a tank. Sometimes it means giving one muddy stream enough time to become part of the earth beneath it. And sometimes the first step toward healing a hillside is a shallow curve, a low ridge, and a boy willing to repair what the rain proves he built wrong.